something didn't explode. It didn't trend. It didn't even make headlines. Instead, it traveled quietly privately until it landed in front of the one person it was never supposed to reach. And when it did, everything stopped. Because when J.D. Vance allegedly saw what had been hidden messages and recordings that directly contradicted the image he had been presented, he didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't explain. He simply walked away. And that silence would end up saying more than any public statement ever could. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you follow deep dive true crime and scandal analysis like this. And as you're watching, drop a comment, tell us what you think is really going on here. And let us know where you're watching from. Because what started as a private leak would quietly unravel a carefully built persona and expose just how fast credibility collapses when the truth reaches the wrong eyes. To understand why this situation mattered as much as it did, you have to understand who the players are and what was at stake long before anything leaked. J.D. Vance is not just another political figure. He's a sitting U.S. senator, a national conservative symbol, and a man whose public image is built on discipline, loyalty, and ideological consistency. Every move he makes is weighed not just personally, but politically. His marriage, his associations, and even his silence carry consequences far beyond his private life. Erika Kirk, on the other hand, positioned herself very differently but very deliberately. Publicly, she presented as aligned, conservative, outspoken, values-driven, and culturally compatible with the world J.D. occupies. To supporters, she appeared principled. To critics, she appeared carefully curated. Either way, her proximity to power made her visibility unavoidable. What made this connection sensitive wasn't just personal chemistry, it was optics. Any perceived closeness between them existed under a microscope. In political spaces, relationships aren't just relationships, they're symbols. And symbols, once questioned, can destabilize entire narratives. Behind closed doors, however, insiders say the dynamic carried more weight than what was visible on stage. Because when public figures allow someone into their inner orbit, it signals trust, alignment, compatibility. And once that trust is questioned, it doesn't just affect feelings, it affects credibility. That's why this story doesn't hinge on one moment, one interaction, or one leak. It hinges on what happens when the image people believed in begins to fracture and the person who once entertained the connection decides to detach completely. And the first signs that something was off didn't come from messages or recordings. They came from behavior. On the surface, everything appeared controlled, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Erika Kirk's public identity was built around consistent, clear values, ideological certainty, and a persona that suggested discipline and restraint. She spoke the language of alignment fluently, presenting herself as someone who belonged naturally within conservative political spaces. To many observers, she didn't just support the movement, she embodied the image it wanted to project. But true crime analysis doesn't stop at what people say. It focuses on what they do and, more importantly, what doesn't quite match. Because while the image remained polished, cracks began forming underneath, small ones at first. Moments that didn't break the narrative outright, but felt misaligned when replayed. Tone that lingered too long. Familiarity that exceeded context. Reactions that seemed personal rather than professional. In true crime storytelling, this is the phase where the audience begins to sense duplication, two versions of the same person existing at once. The public version, carefully maintained, and the private version, glimpsed only in fragments. What made this divide more dangerous was confidence. Sources suggest Erika believed she had full control over how she was perceived. That, as long as nothing surfaced publicly, the narrative would remain intact. And for a while, that assumption appeared to hold. But image control only works when the past stays buried and when private behavior never collides with private audiences. Because the most damaging exposure isn't public humiliation. It's private disappointment. And before any leaks surfaced, before any messages were seen, the warning signs were already there hiding in plain sight. They just hadn't been named yet. In hindsight, the warning signs weren't subtle. They were simply dismissed. True crime analysis often hinges on reevaluation going back to moments that felt uncomfortable but were waved away at the time. And in this case, those moments played out publicly. There were interactions that lingered just a beat too long. Physical closeness that exceeded what the setting called for. Gestures that didn't read as casual to outside observers, even if they were later framed that way. What stood out wasn't just the behavior itself, but the imbalance, one person leaning in, the other appearing guarded. Body language tells stories words don't, and in several public appearances, the contrast was noticeable. Erika appeared relaxed, familiar, and assertive in her proximity. JD, by contrast, appeared restrained, smiling, but stiff, present, but not reciprocal. The kind of posture people adopt when they're trying to move through a moment without escalating it. When speculation began circulating, there was an opportunity to shut it down cleanly, a chance to draw clear boundaries. But instead of clarifying, the response reframed the concern, suggesting the discomfort belonged to the audience, not the interaction itself. That choice mattered. In behavioral analysis, deflection is often more revealing than denial. Rather than addressing how the moment looked, the explanation minimized it entirely. And once a questionable action is reframed as everyone else's misunderstanding, it becomes harder to distinguish intention from excuse. At the time, these moments were bravurnalized internet noisy. But true crime patterns rarely announce themselves all at once. They surface gradually through repetition, through escalation, and through the quiet sense that something isn't lining up. And as it would turn out, those early red flags weren't isolated incidents. They were previews. What finally fractured the situation wasn't a rumor, a clip, or a headline. It was exposure quiet, contained, and impossible to dismiss, according to sources familiar with the situation. Private materials allegedly involving Erika messages and recordings shared by her ex began circulating discreetly. These weren't blasted across timelines or packaged for public consumption. In many ways, that made them more dangerous. Because instead of being diluted by commentary or dismissed as noise, they moved hand to hand and filtered, context intact. And eventually, they reached J.D. Vance. That detail is critical. In true crime narratives, the most consequential evidence isn't always what the public sees, it's what reaches the inner circle. Once something lands directly with the person whose trust is on the line, there's no opportunity to spin it. No buffer, no damage control. Sources say the content didn't just raise questions, it directly contradicted the version of Erika that had been presented behind closed doors. The values, the restraint, the alignment. Suddenly, those claims were staring back in a form that couldn't be reconciled. What made this moment distant embarrassment? It was recognition. Because when private behavior collides with private judgment, the result isn't debate, it's reassessment. And once that reassessment begins, it moves fast. There's no public waiting period, no press strategy, just an internal line being crossed. Insiders say that once JD reviewed the materials, the shift was immediate. Communication cooled, Distance formed. The dynamic changed not gradually, but decisively. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be talked through. It was a conclusion. Once the material was seen, there was no dramatic confrontation, no public fallout, no emotional statements meant to soften the blow. Instead, there was withdrawal. According to people close to the situation, J.D. Vance's reaction wasn't rooted in anger, it was rooted in disgust. Not just at what was revealed, but at what it represented. The realization that the person he had allowed into his orbit may not have been who she claimed to be. In true crime psychology, this kind of reaction is significant. Disgust isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It shuts doors. Sources say the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Where there had once been openness, there was distance. Where there had been tolerance, there was silence. No attempts to explain. No effort to manage optics. Just a clean emotional and relational cut. And that silence mattered more than any statement ever could. Because in high-stakes environments, people don't disengage lightly. When they do, it usually means an internal verdict has already been reached. What's important here is that J.D. didn't move to control the narrative. He didn't deny rumors or defend himself publicly. He didn't need to. His response wasn't designed for the audience, it was personal, final. From a psychological standpoint, this suggests a complete collapse of trust. Once someone realizes that the private version of a person conflicts fundamentally with the public one, the relationship doesn't fracture, it ends. And while Erika would soon attempt to move forward as if nothing had changed, the reality behind the scenes was already set. Because once someone decides you no longer align with their values, there is no argument powerful enough to reverse it. It almost always connects to histopatterns that quietly hint at behavior long before exposure. And in this case, the leak triggered a cascade. Once the private materials surfaced, sources indicate that past moments, previously dismissed or forgotten, suddenly became relevant. Archived media clips, interviews, public appearances that had been interpreted as harmless. All of it was suddenly re-examined through a new lens, one that suggested the private persona and the public image didn't match. It wasn't just one incident. It was a trail. Repeated behaviors that, when pieced together, suggested a pattern of presentation carefully designed to maintain a narrative, even as the reality behind closed doors was inconsistent. True crime investigators know this pattern well, a discrepancy between public and private behavior. Once exposed, erodes trust faster than any single scandal. Each revelation reinforces the previous ones, creating a snowball effect. And this is exactly what happened here, where the past suddenly became a living part of the present, forcing both insiders and the audience to reassess everything they thought they knew. The most revealing aspect wasn't just the exposure of old behavior, it was the way those behaviors aligned with the leaked material. Each prior interaction, every past appearance, every public gesture began to feel like a piece of a larger puzzle, one that confirmed what the leak had already implied. And in the world of influence and politics, pattern recognition is deadly. Because once someone's credibility is questioned repeatedly, even minor missteps can no longer be ignored. Once the past connected to the present, credibility began to crumble. And in situations like this, true crime analysis shows that perception is often as powerful as fact. The audience doesn't just see the leak, they see a pattern of behavior that calls judgment into question. For Erika, what was once a curated image became fragile. Actions and associations previously ignored were now being scrutinized. Media clips, interviews, and even casual appearances were suddenly reinterpreted. all through the lens of the recent exposure. And every attempt to explain or justify fell short because the audience had already been primed to doubt. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance's silence spoke volumes. In high-stakes dynamics, silence is often the most damning response. By choosing to withdraw quietly, he allowed the contrast between public persona and private reality to do the work. There was no public dispute, no defensive posturing, just a decisive absence that reinforced the perception of betrayal. Observers began connecting dots quickly. Allies and supporters who had once tolerated minor inconsistencies now began to question the entirety of her persona. Engagement dropped. Defenses waned. And the gap between perception and reality widened. In the aftermath, sources indicate that Erika Kirk did not disappear quietly. Instead, she made a deliberate effort to reposition herself, to reinsert her image into the story on her own terms. Public endorsements, interviews, and media appearances were carefully timed, strategically framed, and seemingly designed to project loyalty, alignment, and relevance. She presented herself as ideologically consistent, politically useful, and forward-looking. Every statement and gesture was crafted to remind the public and J.D. Vance that she still had a place in the narrative. But in true crime analysis, attempts to control perception after credibility has collapsed are rarely effective. When the audience has already connected the dots, every move is scrutinized for authenticity. And in this case, insiders suggest that J.D. remained unmoved. There were no acknowledgments, no signals that the door had reopened. His detachment became the defining counterpoint to her efforts. The more she attempted to regain footing, the more the contrast between action and reaction was amplified. Every public gesture intended to signal strength or alignment only highlighted the reality behind the scenes. That trust had been broken, and that credibility, once lost, is difficult if not impossible to reclaim. After all the leaks, the past resurfacing, and attempts to reclaim relevance, the most telling factor wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't said. J.D. Vance did not respond publicly. He did not defend, explain, or confront. In true crime terms, silence often carries more weight than words. It communicates judgment, finality, and emotional detachment. The absence of engagement became a verdict in itself. Observers quickly noticed the contrast. Where Erika tried to insert herself back into the story, J.D.'s quiet detachment highlighted the gap between intention and reality. Every calculated statement, every public endorsement, and every attempt to frame the narrative was met with the emptiness of non-response. In high-stakes reputational collapse, this silence is powerful. It signals that the connection has ended, that trust has been irrevocably broken, and that the credibility of the person attempting a rebrand is now measured against a standard they can no longer meet. For viewers and insiders alike, it became clear once someone of influence steps back quietly. No narrative spin, no statement, and no public positioning can fully undo the damage. The story has moved on even if the individual has not. As the dust settles, one question lingers. How far will someone go to reclaim a narrative once credibility has collapsed? Erika Kirk's attempts to realign, reposition, and remain relevant are clear, but the response from J.D. Vance suggests there may be no path back. Silence has replaced engagement. Detachment has replaced connection. And the past has proven that trust, once broken, is rarely restored. True crime teaches us that human behavior often leaves patterns, and that the consequences of exposure, especially in high-stakes environments, are enduring. Actions and reputations cannot simply be rewritten with endorsements or carefully timed appearances. Once the internal verdict has been reached, The court of personal judgment operates quietly but decisively. For viewers, the takeaway is both simple and unsettling. Private behavior, when reveal, has the power to dispublic perception, and when someone chooses detachment over confrontation, the story moves forward with or without the consent of those involved. So we leave you with this. What would you do if the truth you never expected reached the one person whose opinion mattered most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime and high-stakes exposure. Because sometimes, the loudest conclusion isn't spoken. It's the silence that follows.